A new Cold War is being fought across 3 continents, and for the first time in centuries, Africa stands not as a prize to be claimed, but as a kingmaker determining the victor. From the copper mines of Zambia to the uranium deposits of Niger, from the strategic ports of Djibouti to the agricultural heartlands of Mali, a fundamental realignment is reshaping global power dynamics. This isn't merely another chapter in the great game of nations. This is Africa's moment to rewrite the rules entirely. The signs are everywhere. Chinese construction crews work around the clock building the standard gauge railway connecting Nairobi to Mombasa, while Russian military advisors train Malian forces in counter-terrorism operations. African leaders increasingly bypass traditional Western channels, signing agreements directly with Beijing and Moscow that would have been unthinkable just 2 decades ago. The old order, built on centuries of extraction and exploitation, trembles as a new axis of power emerges. But before we examine this seismic shift, we must understand what preceded it. For over 5 centuries, Africa has been subjected to systematic plunder. First, through the brutality of the Atlantic slave trade. Then, the devastating colonial scramble that carved up the continent with arbitrary borders drawn in European boardrooms. And finally, through the subtle but equally destructive mechanisms of neocolonialism that followed independence. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund became the new instruments of control, imposing structural adjustment programs that privatized resources, eliminated subsidies for local farmers, and opened markets to foreign competition that local industries couldn't match. Consider Ghana's experience in the 1980s under structural adjustment. The country was forced to eliminate cocoa subsidies for farmers while simultaneously opening its markets to processed chocolate from Europe. Ghanaian cocoa farmers, who produce some of the world's finest beans, watched helplessly as their livelihoods deteriorated while European chocolatiers built billion-dollar businesses from their raw materials. This pattern repeated across the continent. Nigeria's textile industry collapsed under the weight of cheap imports. Senegal's groundnut farmers were undercut by subsidized American peanuts, and Kenya's coffee growers saw their profits evaporate as processing remained concentrated in the global north. The human cost was staggering. Unemployment soared, currencies devalued, and social services crumbled under austerity measures. Yet when African leaders protested these conditions, they were lectured about governance, democracy, and human rights by the very nations that had created the extractive systems strangling African development. This paternalistic approach revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Western engagement with Africa, a simultaneous demand for gratitude and submission disguised as partnership and aid. Enter China with a radically different proposition. When Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, Africa wasn't treated as a charity case or development project, but as a strategic partner in building 21st century infrastructure. The contrast couldn't be starker. Where Western institutions offered loans tied to governance reforms and market liberalization, China offered to build railways, ports, hospitals, and universities with no lectures about internal politics or demands for democratic reforms. The numbers tell the story. Chinese trade with Africa reached $254 billion in 2021, surpassing the United States by a factor of 4. More importantly, this trade increasingly involves value-added manufacturing rather than simple resource extraction. Ethiopia's leather industry now supplies shoes to European markets through Chinese-built factories. Rwanda processes coffee for export through Chinese-funded facilities. Ghana refines its own cocoa through partnerships with Chinese companies rather than shipping raw beans to Europe. This transformation extends far beyond economics. The Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, built by Chinese companies, reduced transport costs between Ethiopia's capital and its primary port by 60%. The economic ripple effects have been transformative. Small-scale farmers can now affordably transport goods to market. Manufacturing becomes viable without prohibitive logistics costs, and regional integration accelerates as transportation barriers disappear. Similar projects across the continent are creating the physical infrastructure that makes intra-African trade possible for the first time since colonization disrupted traditional trade routes. Critics dismiss these developments as debt trap diplomacy, but this analysis fundamentally misunderstands both Chinese motivations and African agency. Unlike Western loans that come with conditionalities requiring policy changes, Chinese financing typically involves assets as collateral. The infrastructure itself. If a country cannot service its debt, China doesn't seize control of the government or impose austerity measures. It negotiates operational arrangements for specific assets. Kenya's experience with the standard gauge railway illustrates this perfectly. Despite concerns about debt sustainability, the railway continues operating under Kenyan sovereignty while China recovers its investment through operational agreements. More importantly, African leaders are sophisticated negotiators, fully aware of these dynamics. When Kenyan President William Ruto renegotiates Chinese contracts, or when Senegalese President Macky Sall insists on local content requirements for Chinese projects, they demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking that Western media rarely acknowledges exists among African leaders. These aren't naive politicians being exploited by cunning foreigners. They're experienced negotiators extracting maximum value from competing global powers. Russia's re-engagement with Africa follows different pathways but serves similar purposes. Where China focuses on economic infrastructure, Russia offers security partnerships and resource extraction deals that challenge Western monopolies. Russian military contractors provide training and equipment to African forces fighting insurgencies that Western powers either ignored or exacerbated through their own interventions. The results speak for themselves. Malian forces trained by Russian advisors have achieved greater success against jihadist groups in 6 months than French forces accomplished in nearly a decade. This security cooperation extends beyond military training. Russian companies bring expertise in nuclear energy, helping countries like Egypt and Nigeria develop civilian nuclear programs that reduce dependence on fossil fuel imports. Russian agricultural technology helps African farmers increase yields without relying on expensive Western seeds and fertilizers designed to create perpetual dependency. These partnerships offer African nations alternatives to Western suppliers who have traditionally used their monopoly positions to extract maximum profits from African markets. The energy sector provides perhaps the clearest example of this shift. For decades, Western oil companies extracted African petroleum while providing minimal value addition locally. Nigerian oil was refined in European facilities and sold back to Nigeria at massive markups. Angolan petroleum enriched American and European companies, while ordinary Angolans lacked access to reliable electricity. Russian energy companies, by contrast, increasingly offer comprehensive packages that include local refining capacity, technology transfer, and job creation for African workers. However, the most significant aspect of this realignment isn't Chinese railways or Russian military training. It's the demonstration that alternatives to Western dominance exist. For the first time since independence, African leaders can credibly threaten to walk away from Western partnerships because genuine alternatives exist. This leverage transforms every negotiation. When French companies refuse to pay fair prices for uranium from Niger, the country can credibly threaten to sell to Russian buyers instead. When American agricultural companies demand monopolistic access to seed markets, African governments can negotiate with Chinese suppliers offering better terms. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Generations of African leaders grew up believing they had no choice but to accept whatever terms Western powers offered. The current generation has witnessed the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia as global powers actively competing for African partnership. This competition benefits Africa because it allows African nations to play competing powers against each other, rather than accepting dictated terms from a single hegemon. Yet this opportunity comes with significant risks that African leaders must navigate carefully. The fundamental danger lies not in partnering with China and Russia, but in trading one form of dependency for another. True sovereignty requires diversified partnerships that prevent any single power from gaining excessive leverage over African affairs. The most successful African countries are those that maintain productive relationships with multiple global powers while prioritizing their own strategic interests above all else. Rwanda exemplifies this sophisticated approach. President Paul Kagame maintains strong relationships with China, Russia, the United States, and European nations while consistently prioritizing Rwandan interests. When Western donors threatened to cut aid over Rwanda's military involvement in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kagame didn't capitulate. He diversified partnerships and reduced dependence on Western funding. Today, Rwanda enjoys one of Africa's highest growth rates while maintaining strategic autonomy that allows the country to pursue its own development path. Similarly, Botswana has leveraged its diamond wealth to maintain relationships with multiple global powers, while building robust democratic institutions that serve Botswana interests rather than foreign preferences. The country's diamond industry partnership with De Beers demonstrates how African nations can negotiate beneficial arrangements with traditional Western companies when they possess leverage and sophisticated negotiating strategies. The youth demographic adds another crucial dimension to this analysis. Africa's population will double to 2.5 billion by 2050, with 60% under age 25. This generation has grown up witnessing China's rise, Russia's resurgence, and the relative decline of Western powers. They're less impressed by Western lectures about democracy and human rights when those same Western powers support authoritarian regimes in the Middle East while imposing economic policies that perpetuate African poverty. Young Africans increasingly view Western development aid with skepticism, recognizing it as a mechanism for maintaining dependency rather than promoting genuine development. They prefer Chinese infrastructure projects that create visible improvements in daily life over Western governance programs that produce endless reports but few tangible benefits. This generational shift in attitudes will fundamentally reshape Africa's global relationships over the coming decades. The media dimension of this realignment deserves particular attention. Western media coverage of Africa consistently emphasizes chaos, corruption, and conflict, while ignoring success stories and sophisticated leadership. This narrative serves to justify continued Western intervention and to dismiss African agency in global affairs. The rise of alternative media outlets funded by China and Russia provides African perspectives often ignored by Western sources. However, African media independence remains crucial for authentic sovereignty. The most important developments in African media are indigenous outlets, like Nigeria's Channels Television, South Africa's Daily Maverick, and Kenya's The Star, that provide African perspectives on continental affairs without serving as proxies for any foreign power. These outlets increasingly challenge both Western and Eastern narratives while centering African interests and perspectives. Pan-African cooperation represents perhaps the greatest opportunity arising from this global realignment. As external powers compete for African partnerships, continental integration becomes both more feasible and more urgent. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2021, creates the world's largest free trade zone by participating countries and has the potential to increase intra-African trade by 52% by 2030. Chinese infrastructure projects facilitate this integration by connecting African economies that colonialism deliberately separated. The proposed Lagos-Abidjan corridor will link West Africa's largest economies, while the standard gauge railway system plans to eventually connect East African ports to landlocked countries across the region. Russian partnerships in energy and agriculture can reduce African dependence on food and fuel imports from outside the continent. But the real transformation requires African leaders to think continentally rather than nationally. Presidents like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso represent a new generation of leaders who explicitly frame their policies in terms of African liberation rather than narrow national interests. Traoré's decision to end France's military presence in Burkina Faso while developing partnerships with Russia reflects a broader continental awakening that prioritizes African sovereignty over inherited colonial relationships. This shift requires distinguishing between genuine sovereignty movements and opportunistic power grabs disguised as anti-colonial rhetoric. Leaders who use anti-Western rhetoric while looting their country's resources serve neither sovereignty nor their people's interests. True African liberation requires leaders who combine anti-colonial positioning with effective governance that improves ordinary Africans' lives. The economic analysis reveals both the opportunities and challenges ahead. Africa possesses 60% of the world's arable land, 30% of global mineral reserves, and the world's youngest population. These assets provide enormous leverage in negotiations with global powers if African leaders use them strategically. However, realizing this potential requires moving beyond raw material exports to value-added processing that creates jobs and builds technological capacity. Chinese partnerships offer opportunities for technological transfer and industrialization that Western relationships have historically denied. Russian partnerships provide alternatives in energy and agriculture that reduce dependence on Western suppliers. But African leaders must negotiate these partnerships from positions of strength rather than desperation, ensuring that technology transfer, local content requirements, and capacity building remain central to all agreements. The regional context varies significantly across the continent. North African countries like Egypt and Algeria possess strong state capacities and sophisticated diplomatic traditions that allow them to negotiate complex partnerships with multiple global powers simultaneously. West African nations are increasingly asserting sovereignty over natural resources, while demanding greater value addition locally. East African countries are leveraging their strategic locations to attract infrastructure investments while maintaining diplomatic flexibility. Southern Africa presents a unique case where established relationships with both Western and Eastern powers create opportunities for sophisticated balancing strategies. Countries like Namibia and Zambia can leverage their mineral wealth to attract investments from multiple sources while maintaining strategic autonomy. The challenge lies in ensuring that resource revenues benefit ordinary citizens rather than enriching narrow elites. The transformation currently unfolding across Africa represents more than a simple realignment of partnerships. It's the emergence of authentic African agency in global affairs. For centuries, African voices have been marginalized in international forums, while decisions affecting the continent were made in Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels. Today, African leaders increasingly make their own decisions based on their own assessments of their country's interests. This agency manifests in concrete policy choices. When Malian leaders expelled French forces while inviting Russian military advisors, they made a sovereign decision based on their assessment of security needs. When Ethiopian leaders chose Chinese financing for the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam despite Western objections, they prioritized national development over diplomatic pressure. When South African leaders refused to condemn Russia over Ukraine while maintaining relationships with all parties, they demonstrated strategic autonomy rather than automatic alignment with Western positions. The youth perspective adds urgency to these transformations. Young Africans increasingly reject the premise that their continent should remain a supplier of raw materials to wealthy nations while importing finished goods at premium prices. They demand value-added processing, technology transfer, and partnerships that create opportunities for African entrepreneurs and innovators. This generational shift drives political changes that prioritize sovereignty and self-determination over inherited colonial relationships. However, achieving true sovereignty requires more than changing international partnerships. It requires building domestic capacities that reduce dependence on any foreign power. This means investing in education systems that produce skilled workers, developing financial institutions that can mobilize domestic savings for investment, and creating legal frameworks that protect intellectual property and encourage innovation. The most successful African countries will be those that use competition between global powers to build their own capabilities rather than simply trading one form of dependency for another. This requires sophisticated leadership that can navigate complex international relationships while maintaining focus on domestic development priorities. Looking ahead, the next decade will be crucial for determining whether Africa's current leverage translates into lasting sovereignty, or simply creates new forms of dependency with different masters. The outcome depends largely on whether African leaders can maintain unity around continental interests while building the domestic capacities necessary for genuine independence. The signs are encouraging. The African Union increasingly speaks with one voice on international issues, while regional economic communities deepen integration that reduces dependence on external markets. Young African entrepreneurs are building businesses that serve continental markets rather than simply exporting raw materials. African universities are developing technologies appropriate for African conditions rather than simply importing solutions designed elsewhere. But challenges remain significant. Corruption continues to drain resources that should fund development. Conflicts in several regions divert attention and resources from long-term planning. Climate change threatens agricultural productivity and forces costly adaptations. Global economic uncertainties create risks for countries dependent on commodity exports. Nevertheless, the fundamental trajectory seems clear. Africa's leverage in global affairs will only increase as the continent's population and economies grow while global powers compete for partnerships. The question isn't whether Africa will play a larger role in shaping the 21st century, but whether African leaders will use their growing influence wisely to benefit their people and advance continental integration. The current moment represents a historic inflection point. For the first time since the colonial conquest, African nations possess genuine alternatives to Western partnerships and can negotiate from positions of relative strength. This opportunity may not last forever. Global power dynamics could shift in ways that reduce Africa's leverage, or internal conflicts could fragment the continent's growing unity. African leaders and citizens must therefore act decisively to lock in gains from the current favorable environment. This means accelerating continental integration, diversifying international partnerships, building domestic capacities, and maintaining unity around core sovereignty principles, while avoiding the trap of trading one form of dependency for another. The stakes couldn't be higher. Success could usher in an African century characterized by prosperity, dignity, and genuine self-determination. Failure could result in new forms of exploitation and dependency that perpetuate the continent's marginalization in global affairs. The choice belongs to Africa, and the time to choose is now. This transformation extends far beyond geopolitics. It's fundamentally about human dignity and the right of African peoples to determine their own futures. For too long, others have made decisions about African affairs while treating African voices as irrelevant to conversations about African destinies. That era is ending, replaced by an emerging reality where African agency shapes global outcomes rather than simply responding to decisions made elsewhere. The emergence of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré symbolizes this broader awakening. Young, educated, and unapologetically committed to African sovereignty, such leaders represent a generation that refuses to accept inherited limitations on African potential. They understand that true liberation requires both rejecting neo-colonial relationships and building alternative partnerships based on mutual respect rather than dependency. This is Africa's moment to shape the 21st century. The continent possesses the resources, the population, and increasingly the leadership necessary to become a major force in global affairs. The question isn't whether this transformation will occur, but how quickly and how completely African nations can realize their potential, while maintaining the unity necessary for collective strength. If you believe in Africa's right to sovereignty and self-determination, if you support leaders who genuinely serve African interests rather than foreign masters, if you want to stay informed about the most important geopolitical transformation of our time, then your engagement matters. Like this video to support content that centers African perspectives and challenges Western narratives about African affairs. Subscribe to this channel to ensure you never miss analysis of the movements and leaders reshaping Africa's relationship with the world. Share this video with others who need to understand that Africa's rise isn't just about economics or politics. It's about the fundamental human right to self-determination that has been denied to African peoples for far too long. Ring the notification bell because the story of Africa's liberation is still being written, and every chapter matters for understanding where the continent and the world are headed. Your engagement isn't just social media metrics. It's part of supporting the broader African sovereignty movement by ensuring that authentic African voices reach larger audiences. In a world where Western media continues to distort African realities, while Eastern media promotes its own interests, supporting independent African perspectives becomes an act of solidarity with continental liberation. The alliance between China, Russia, and Africa may not end Western dominance overnight, but it has already ended Western monopoly over African partnerships. That alone represents a historic victory for African sovereignty and a foundation for the even greater triumphs that lie ahead. The 21st century will be shaped by how well African leaders and peoples seize this unprecedented opportunity to finally realize the promise of genuine independence and self-determination.